We're joined today by Joseph Hernandez. He's the Republican candidate for New York State Comptroller. Joseph, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for doing this with us.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right, this is the easy one to start. Why is this something you're jumping into right now? Obviously, you were on the ballot as a candidate for New York City mayor, so you took a dip into that world there, and now why pivot at this point to the comptroller race for the state?
Well, anyway, I appreciate the opportunity again. I jumped into this. I jumped into the mayoral race with really one mission in mind, and that is to really use it as a platform to articulate, what socialism and communism is, and how the dangers of that. Really, I came from Cuba. I was born in Cuba, and so I spent the early part of my life there, and I know how dangerous that is for a society and how it robs humanity of the individuality and of grit and hard work. I don't think it's good for America. It's certainly not good for New York. So I jumped into the mayoral race with that messaging in mind. And this is just an extension of that. Really, I was asked to look at this opportunity, and I thought I could be helpful and just to give back to this great society that gave me and my family so much. That's really why I'm doing it.
Really quick, just to follow up on the concept of socialism, and obviously you being from Cuba, an immigrant here, and I know that that's been thrown, and even the word communist has been thrown around in the way some of Zohran Mamdani's policies and the way he campaigned. But I think at times people, obviously socialism, there's dictatorships that come along with that. You wouldn't say that Zohran Mamdani is going to be a dictator, right? I guess, can you just better define that for us as to how you would see it? Because I think those things have sometimes been combined in countries around the world.
Yeah. Listen, I think I really view communism 1 degree away from socialism. I mean, I think this concept of collectivism, which is, that government is better suited to run government and to run things than the individual private marketplace is really in my opinion, the distinction. Look, the reality is America and New York City was built on capitalism, was built on the individual, was built on the grid of the entrepreneurship mindset, and anything that deviates from that brings in this sort of concept that collectivism works is in my opinion dangerous for us. And so that's why I'm really touting the benefits of capitalism and what's made America great. I mean, look, America's transformed the world and society in the last 250 years. No other society has ever done that. I mean, the advancements we've made in science and medicine and technology has been because of capitalism. I mean, if you had put collectivism as the primary driving engine, I think you would have achieved a fraction of what we've achieved in this great society. And New York is really the center of that. I mean, if you look at New York, first of all, New York City is the center of capitalism, and New York is the state. If you think of companies like General Electric, Corning, Remington, Kodak, these are companies that transform not only America, but also the world. So we have been the center of capitalism for a very long period of time. And the fact that we have socialism creeping in New York City and in Albany is a very scary outlook. And I am just standing here and saying, let's not change what's worked for America for the last 250 years.
Yeah, we'll follow up on that because I think it leads into obviously your campaign and the office you're running for. Is that some now these days have argued that capitalism and the way it's been conducted has allowed the rich to get richer, the poor to get poorer, and more of a separation, and the money being all allocated to that 1%. Obviously, as you approach this office, how would you try to address that?
Look, I think we need government needs to obviously play a role in this to make sure that the powerful don't become utterly powerful. I mean, I think that's the role of government. But as it relates to entrepreneurship and the risk taking that is in the American culture, I think that's what's defined the greatness of America. I mean, we are the envy of the world in that regard, and I think changing that is a mistake. If you look at socialism and communism, it's killed about 100 million people when you really aggregate the amount of deaths in these different societies like Cuba and Venezuela and the Soviet Union, Mao's China. By contrast, capitalism has brought 1 billion people out of poverty. It's really it's been an astronomical benefit to humanity, and I think look, we have to make sure that we keep oversight over this kind of ideology, but certainly I think that the benefits outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, we could have a long conversation about that. And obviously it also plays into your mentality heading into this campaign. As you approach the comptroller office, where do you start? What is something you would like to address on day one if elected?
Yeah, look, I think there's three major areas that we want to focus on. This office is supposed to be the watchdog for the taxpayer. It's supposed to be the last gate before dollars leave the coffers of the state for payments. And in my opinion, it's been poorly managed for a lot of different reasons. First of all, if you look at the other duty of the office is to manage the pension fund. And when you look at the pension fund, it's a $292 billion pension fund. It's one of the largest in America. A lot of power. The pension fund alone has $3.2 billion invested in Microsoft, 1.2 invested in Google. So these are very influential funds. And unfortunately, we've gotten a really bad return. Last year, we returned about 5.8%, which, by the way, if you put that money in treasury bills, you probably would do just about the same when you back out the fees that we're paying Wall Street. We're paying Wall Street about $1.4 billion in fees, which is ridiculous. With that kind of return, we shouldn't pay anybody anything. You would be fired on Wall Street if you got those kinds of returns. So my first strategy is to make sure that we increase the returns on the pension fund. That's important for pensioners, but it's also important for the taxpayers, because if we don't meet our obligations on the pension side, we basically have to pass the hat around the different municipalities and city and ask them to contribute for the pension. So it does have an impact on the taxpayer base. The other thing we would do is, in addition to sort of improving the performance there, which I plan to do that by bringing in an in-house investment team that really understands how to invest. I work on Wall Street. I know the investment community here. And in my opinion, that's the best strategy to roll out on the pension fund. CalPERS does it. The teachers union in Canada does it. There's a lot of examples of how this model works. So I'm going to do that. The next thing is really this fraud and abuse that we see pervasive in the nation. Look, our Medicaid budget is about over 100 billion. It's about $110 billion. It pales in comparison to what Minnesota has a $19 billion Medicaid budget. And if you look at the fraud and abuse that's happened in Minnesota, I can guarantee you New York State is going to be 10x greater than we've seen in terms of fraud and abuse. So I'm gonna really focus heavily on that. I'm gonna hire an in-house strike team to focus on fraud. I'm gonna staff it with forensic accountants, with financial crimes prosecutor, and I'm gonna have the federal prosecutors and the state prosecutors on speed dial to make sure that the people that are robbing from our taxpayers don't get away with it. And then the third part of our strategy is to use the fund for economic development to really invest in New York. Look, we're investing in these big companies. They should be investing in our state. And so I'm gonna call the CEO of Microsoft. I'm gonna call the CEO of Google and say, look, we believe in you. You need to believe in our state, and ask them to really invest in our state. But also I'm going to do venture. I'm going to bring in some new companies and the next generation of technologies, artificial intelligence, life sciences, biotech, advanced manufacturing, aviation, things that are really driving the marketplace, and establish those companies here and use the economic development funds, elements of the fund to do that. Because we got to create the next tax base for New York, but also create the next generation of jobs for our kids.
Let's start after that with the pension fund, because I think that the comptroller is touted saying that we're known as being responsible. We have a good rating on it, and we've heard, well, we're not getting as much out of it as we can. But they would say then, well, we're just being fiscally responsible. We're not taking risks. How would you avoid maybe taking a risk and trying to get more growth, more return, and at the same time making sure people aren't being impacted negatively because of that?
Look, I think one of the first things you learn in finance course, which I'm not sure our current comptroller has taken, is portfolio theory. You don't do this by putting all your capital in one risky portfolio. You don't do that. You certainly disperse your portfolio, and you do it in a way that your net benefit is an upward return. I mean, if you look at the S&P last year returned about 15%. We're not saying that you should have that kind of return, but if you look at CalPERS, which is a peer fund, it's the California pension fund, they returned almost 12%. We got 5.8. The only thing they did different is they had an in-house investment team that focused on things that are high growth, like venture, like private credit, like international investments. There's no reason that you shouldn't have that kind of management. And by the way, they weren't paying Wall Street these crazy fees that we paid. We paid Wall Street, as I said, $1.4 billion in fees last year. There's a better way to manage it. I'm not saying you take on undue risk, because that's not the role. The role is you're a fiduciary to make sure the pensioners have a return, but you also need to make smart investment decisions. And I think I would argue that this comptroller has not done that.
Is there any place, anywhere, any company that you would immediately invest or divest in or from?
Look, I think broadly, I think you got to look at venture. I think, where you see all the growth, you see a lot of growth in artificial intelligence and technology. I would certainly be more aggressive about investing in those sectors. And then and again, I would use it as a means to get companies to invest in New York. This is the next generation of businesses, the next generation of jobs. Look, artificial intelligence is really what electricity was, a couple hundred years ago. It is transformative. It's changing the way we live. It's changing the way we work. We should be leaders in that. New York State has been the leader in every industrial revolution, every aspect of technology, including electricity. We should be spearheading this technology revolution. There's things in automation and aviation and robotics that we should be investing in as a state and as a pension fund.
I think it was in the New York Post when you announced, you did an interview there. I want to make sure I get it right. You talked about investing and what have you and managing the fund, and said it should be in the best interest of pensioners and it shouldn't be political. Is that right? Is that what you said?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we have, and by the way, New York is not the only one. I think a lot of these pension funds have started using political filters to make investment decisions. That is not the role of the comptroller. The comptroller, it has a fiduciary duty to manage this money for the people that have given their careers and their lives to the state. And the only filter we should be using is internal rate of return. I think these political filters are dangerous. They lead us down a path of complacency and of lack of returns. And I think you're seeing that in the current fund.
But should you be wary, though, potentially of investing in something that might not be moral or might not be?
Look, I think you have to use a moral compass. I'm not saying you don't use a moral compass, but these issues of using your name it, your flavor of the month political filter to make decisions, investment decisions. I think that's dangerous. That is not in the best interest of our pensioners. It's not in the best interest of our taxpayers. And I would argue it is not in the context of the fiduciary duty and the responsibility that the sole trustee as comptroller has for the fund. And I wouldn't use that filter. I would never use a political filter. I think you have to use a moral filter, but I think if you're in this business, you have to have a moral filter or you won't last.
Sure. Let's get to the auditing aspect of things and the reports and some of that oversight. You mentioned the Medicaid issue. Obviously, that's been on a lot of people's minds. You talked about Minnesota and now broadly as we look at the country as a whole, at the federal government. You talked about just in terms of the oversight of the Medicaid program. I did look, as I saw you did an interview with WBNG about this, talking about CDPAP and saying it was behind. I mean, there was 9 different audits last year, 16 the year before, double digits in Medicaid alone out of that office. Is that not enough for you, or is it the timing of those? What about it doesn't go far enough?
Look, the audits that we're doing are retrospective audits. They're audits that look, a number of years behind. Oftentimes, the individuals that committed these crimes aren't even around. The money's left the coffers. What exercise do we get out of telling taxpayers that they just got robbed $1.2 billion, which is what happened in the case of CDPAP. I believe in real-time audits. I believe that there's technologies out there that allow us to really flag these areas that are prone to fraud and abuse. Medicaid is a perfect example, but there's a long list of examples that are prone to fraud and abuse. And just by having sophisticated analytics and data mining tools, you can pick these things up and you can stop it before it gets out of hand. And then the other thing you got to do is you got to be aggressive about the prosecution. Pointing out fraud and abuse and theft only has so much value. You got to be aggressive about building a case file to make sure that these individuals that are robbing taxpayers don't get away with it. And you have to involve the federal prosecutors. You have to involve the attorney general to make sure that these people don't get away with the crime they're committing. At the end of the day, every dollar that gets stolen here is a dollar that gets stolen from our kids, from our law enforcement officials, from our road repairs. I mean, this is something we should be very angry about. We should be mad. We should be pounding on the table, and we're not doing that right now.
The comptroller, the office and his campaign, I should say, has pushed back on this whole notion of the power of the office and saying, well, by law, the office can't force or compel state agencies or local governments to implement these audit recommendations. How do you work through that? How do you work with that?
I disagree that 100%. I mean, I think the audit, the audit is one of the central roles of the comptroller's office. Every dollar that leaves the state that goes to pay vendors comes to the comptroller's office. Every contract that's over $50,000 needs to be signed off by Napoli. So I don't subscribe to the notion that this is a toothless role. That's absolutely not the case. Not only do you have the ability to stop payments, you have the ability to challenge the validity of those payments. And further, you have the ability to create prosecution files in the event that there's fraud and abuse and hand that to prosecutors. They have a duty to enforce the law. It's not in the comptroller's office, but you certainly have the ability to create a case file for that. And I would argue that this is a very powerful role. It hasn't been used because it's been a political position. It's supposed to be the watchdog of the taxpayer, and it's become, in my opinion, a lapdog. It's not really, it's a ceremonial position as it's been for the last 17 years. If I take office, I guarantee you it's not going to be that. I'm going to be an aggressive comptroller. We're going to make sure that every dollar that leaves, the coffers of the taxpayers, that it's intended to be a justified dollar. And if there's fraud and abuse, I'll stop it day one.
One more, obviously, on the economic development aspect of your campaign here, the funds there. We've heard some of your competitors on the other side of the aisle talk about affordable housing. Is there a specific place that you think that is missing investment right now that can really make a big difference? You also talked about AI.
Yeah, look, I think you have to treat the economic development angle as a venture capitalist, like you would. You're going to take risks in areas of growth. That's where the returns are, and that's where I would argue the next generation of jobs are. Things like artificial intelligence, things like broad pharmaceuticals and healthcare and biotech. Things like advanced manufacturing. I mean, look, we have the Micron facility that's being built there. It's about $100 billion going in there in investments. We should leverage that as a platform to bring in other, semiconductor-like related businesses that are down and up the supply chain for semiconductors. So we have an ability to bring in, and by the way, these are great paying jobs. It's a great tax base. It expands our tax base. It moves it away from, right now we count on Wall Street so much for our tax base. Wall Street comes and goes. It's a cyclical business, as you know. You can have 4 great years of Wall Street and 4 horrible years. Our budget heavily depends on that. We got to diversify the tax base, but more importantly, we got to create jobs for your kids, for my kids, so they don't have to leave the state for good jobs. And I think this is a wise investment. It's going to have good returns. Again, we're going to use the initial filter to make sure we have good internal rate of return. But we got to invest in New York. We have to. It is imperative that we do that. Can we do other things like affordable housing? Again, the filter has to be, is there a return? And I would argue that if there is a return in doing housing projects, we'll look at that. Absolutely.
Does that investment, do those ideas change depending on downstate or upstate in the city or in a more rural area, if you will?
Look, I think upstate and the western parts of New York have been neglected for a number of years. From Albany doesn't pay attention to them because that's not where their voter base is. And that's, in my opinion, that's horrible. I think all taxpayers are taxpayers, whether they have a D or an R to their name, and I will certainly view the world like that, and certainly view investments like that. I think you have to create economic development across the state. I would argue that that there's some opportunities that are valid and valuable in upstate and western parts of New York, and just like there are opportunities here in Manhattan. So I wouldn't use that filter in my decision making. I think, look, if the state wins, we all win. We have a better tax base. We have better jobs for our next generation of New Yorkers. And ultimately, we have a better society and a government that provides the services at a low cost, at an efficient cost that they deserve, and they're justified. Look, we are the most taxed society in America. We should have the best government, and unfortunately, we have the worst government. We got to change that.
More of a political question for you now. There was a report today in City and State by one of my colleagues, Kate Lisa, talking about a fundraiser thrown by a Republican for Thomas DiNapoli this week. As the Republican here on the ballot, what's your reaction to that?
Listen, Tom DiNapoli, from what I hear, is a nice guy. I think at the end of the day, you got to look at performance. He hasn't been challenged in 17 years. I think he's got a lot of friends across the aisle, and I respect him for that. But at the end of the day, this is a job that is supposed to be the watchdog for the taxpayers. That hasn't happened, and I'm here to change that. And look, as soon as people hear my messaging, I can tell you we're getting a lot of support. I'm new to the scene. I'm not a politician. I'm a business guy. And I am getting support across the spectrum, both from Democrats and from Republicans. So I envision that I'm going to be a real challenge to him, and I think ultimately I'll win.
Finally, your story. Obviously, you're an immigrant. You come from Cuba. What should people know about you, the person?
Look, I came to this country with nothing. I came at the age of 7. My dad was a political prisoner. We crossed the states of Florida during a storm. I mean, it's like a movie. My dad came here. He washed dishes. My mom cleaned houses. I came from nothing, and this great country allowed me to get 5 degrees. I went to University of Florida. I went to Yale. I went to Oxford. I have brought 12 companies, created 12 companies. I brought 5 of them public. I've rang the NASDAQ bell twice. That only happens in this great society. I am so grateful. I wake up every morning saying, thank God that I am living in America, because this is a very unique place. This is the most amazing country in the world. And I am just doing what I can to pay back to this great society that gave me so much. That's my only purpose for doing this.
I want to ask, how did that opportunity come? You just spoke of, obviously, an incredible work ethic of all those different institutions and businesses. What clicked? What was the springboard for you? As someone that probably came here and didn't know much about what was the situation.
It was the desire to better my life and better my family's life, but also to have an impact. I think, we all sometimes lose track of the fact that you have to give back. You have to give back to this great society. I mean, this great country wasn't created by accident. It doesn't continue to be a great country if we all stay on the sidelines. We have to raise our hand and say, you know what? It is my time to give back to this society, and that's what I'm doing. I really am in love with America, and I'm just trying to give back a portion of what this great country has given me.
Joseph Hernandez, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Tom. You have a good one.